A woman walked onto the military firing range at Fort Brixton, an outlier in a sea of burly, uniformed Marines. She didn't look like she belonged, not in the least. Her movements were smooth but unassuming, and her civilian clothes stood out against the camo and tactical gear of the Marines around her. As she stepped closer to the range, a few of the younger Marines sneered, their laughter almost inaudible, but their judgments loud enough to make her feel the weight of their gaze. She wasn't tall, her frame was slight, and her demeanor was quiet. Everything about her screamed out of place. She was the type of woman they might dismiss, assuming she'd never held a weapon in her life. The sounds of the Marines preparing for their drills filled the air as she approached an unattended M4 carbine. She stood at a slight distance, clearly not rushing, but with an air of purpose. As the range safety officer eyed her from the other side, there was a brief moment of hesitation before he gave her a curt, disinterested shrug. "Knock yourself out. Just don't embarrass yourself." The Marines around her shared an amused glance, one that made it clear they didn't believe she'd be able to handle the recoil, let alone fire with any accuracy. But when she lifted the M4, there was something undeniably precise about her movements. Her fingers chambered the round effortlessly, the motions smooth and natural, like someone who had done this 1,000 times. She didn't adjust the sights, nor did she waste time on practice shots. She steadied herself, taking a deep, controlled breath, and within seconds, she squeezed the trigger. The sharp crack of the gunshot echoed through the range. One shot, then another, until 5 shots rang out in rapid succession. The Marines had been talking, laughing amongst themselves, their voices growing quieter with each shot. By the time the 5th round hit, they had all stopped what they were doing and were watching. The young recruits, who moments before had been mocking her, stood frozen, staring at the target downrange. It wasn't a normal grouping. Not for anyone who was just a casual shooter. This wasn't luck. The shots were dead center, perfectly placed in a tight cluster, as though they'd all come from the same pull of the trigger. The instructor, a seasoned sergeant, halted mid-sentence as he stared at the target. His eyes flicked from the hole in the paper to the woman standing there, rifle in hand, unbothered. No one said anything for a long moment, the silence heavier than any words could have been. The younger Marine standing closest muttered, "Probably just lucky." But his voice lacked the confidence it had before. There was uncertainty in his words now. He wasn't sure anymore. Riley set the M4 down carefully on the bench, but the murmur of the Marines didn't fade. They were still too stunned to speak. She ignored them, focusing on her movements as she rolled up her sleeves. The fabric of her jacket shifted, revealing a faded tattoo that had previously been hidden beneath the fabric. It was small, barely visible, but it was enough to change everything. The faint, worn ink of a SEAL Team 9 trident marked her wrist, scars running parallel to it. The instant the tattoo caught Blake Harrison's eye, the silence that had hung in the air shifted. He had served with SEALs for over 15 years, and he knew that insignia that was no ordinary tattoo. A cold realization dawned on him. This wasn't just another civilian on the range. It was someone who had walked the path of SEALs, someone whose legacy in the military community carried weight far beyond their appearance. The reactions from the Marines shifted almost instantly, from mockery to confusion. Their laughter died, and their skepticism turned into something more cautious, more respectful. They had misjudged her, and they knew it now. Their laughter had been a reflex, but Riley's shooting had been far beyond anything they had expected. The one thing that could not be faked was precision, and hers had been flawless. But Riley didn't react. She didn't offer an explanation or acknowledge the change in the air. She'd learned long ago that sometimes silence was the most powerful answer. The truth was clearer in the quiet, when actions spoke louder than any words ever could. The woman they had mocked for being a civilian was someone far more than they had ever imagined. Riley lowered the M4 gently onto the bench, the metallic click of the rifle's stock against the surface briefly cutting through the stillness that had settled over the range. Her hands moved with practiced ease, wiping away a smear of sweat from her brow. As she shifted, the sleeve of her jacket pulled up slightly, exposing a faint tattoo on her wrist. The worn ink barely caught the light, but for anyone who knew what to look for, it was unmistakable, the trident insignia of SEAL Team 9 etched into her skin. The sudden shift in the air was palpable. The few Marines who were still watching her now found their gazes drifting to her arm, the subtle marking that had gone unnoticed moments before now standing out, like a neon sign. It wasn't just any tattoo. It was a symbol reserved for the most elite warriors, for those who had proven themselves in ways most people would never understand. The tattoo was a badge of honor, but it was also a secret one that Riley had kept hidden from the world. For a moment, No one spoke. The jokes that had been tossed around like casual insults only minutes ago seemed foolish now, the harshness of their laughter turning into an awkward silence. They stood still, frozen in their disbelief, trying to reconcile the image of the small, quiet woman with the truth now slowly dawning on them. They had mocked her, underestimated her, and yet there was no denying it. Now the woman standing in front of them wasn't just a civilian. She wasn't just some outsider pretending to understand what combat meant. She had lived it. Blake Harrison, who had been walking toward the firing line, noticed the change in the air the moment he saw the tattoo. His eyes locked onto the insignia, the faint scars running parallel to it, and he stopped mid-step. Everything about the woman, the way she had moved, the way she handled the weapon, even the subtle look of controlled focus on her face now clicked into place. She wasn't just anyone. She was someone who had been through things no one in this room could imagine. His gaze shifted from the tattoo to her face, watching for any sign that she was aware of the effect it was having. Riley, still unaware of the sudden shift, continued with her task. She didn't seem to notice the Marine's hesitation or the discomfort that had replaced their earlier mockery. She simply moved, the motions fluid, as though she had performed this routine 1,000 times before. But now, with the tattoo visible, the Marines weren't just watching her, they were trying to piece together a puzzle that none of them had expected to see. A young Marine, still trying to maintain the bravado he'd carried earlier, muttered under his breath. Must have been a fluke. She couldn't have shot that well by accident. His words lacked the force they once had, the uncertainty of the situation seeping through. The others, though, didn't laugh this time. They were too caught up in trying to process the meaning of the tattoo. Riley remained silent, not reacting to the words or the now staring eyes of the Marines. She had long learned that in moments like this, explaining herself only made things worse. It wasn't about what they thought or said. She knew better than to try to change anyone's mind with words. The truth was far clearer when it spoke for itself. The tension continued to grow as the instructor, Sergeant Monroe, stood a few feet away, staring at the target downrange. He had been watching Riley from the corner of his eye, unsure of what to make of the situation. His eyes shifted from the target, where 5 shots had formed a single, ragged hole, back to Riley, his brow furrowing in confusion. "This can't be real," he muttered to himself, barely audible. The disbelief in his voice mirrored the growing unease in the air. Then, as if on cue, Blake stepped forward. His boots made a soft thud against the gravel, and the rest of the Marines stepped aside, their faces a mix of curiosity and apprehension. He walked up to Riley, his expression neutral but his mind racing. There was no mistaking it now. He had seen that tattoo before, whispered about it in the secure confines of military briefings, but he never expected to see it on the arm of a woman standing on a firing range. He stopped a few feet away from her and met her gaze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, laden with unspoken understanding. Blake had served with the SEALs for over a decade, and he had heard the stories, the legends about a female operative known only as Ghost, whose name was spoken in hushed tones. She was rumored to have pulled off missions so dangerous, so high risk, that even the CIA had considered them beyond the realm of possibility. Yet no one had ever seen her face. No one had ever known her true identity. Riley's calm demeanor in the face of Blake's penetrating stare made it clear. She was no ordinary soldier. Her silence spoke volumes. She wasn't here to explain herself, and she certainly wasn't here to boast about her past. All she needed was to be left alone, to continue living in the shadows where she belonged. The truth, as it turned out, didn't need to be announced. It could simply be seen, quietly etched into her skin. Blake, realizing what he was witnessing, nodded slightly to himself, his expression hardening with respect. He knew, in that moment, everything had shifted. The woman standing before him was no civilian. She was a legend, a ghost from the past whose identity had just been revealed by the smallest of clues, a tattoo that few would have recognized, and fewer still would have understood. As the Marines around him started to realize the gravity of the situation, their respect grew, but so did their confusion. The mocking tone had vanished. What replaced it was an uncomfortable silence, the realization that they had been in the presence of greatness and never even knew it. But Riley remained unaffected, her focus now entirely on the rifle she was disassembling. The truth was out, but she didn't need to say anything. She had learned long ago that the world often didn't need to know who you were. Sometimes it was enough just to be. Blake Harrison stood still, staring at Riley, his gaze locked on the faded tattoo on her wrist. The instant he saw it, something clicked in his mind, and his expression shifted. For the first time, He truly saw her. He didn't just see the small woman standing in front of him, trying to blend into the background. He saw the ghost of Coronado, the legend that had disappeared years ago, leaving behind only whispers and rumors. It wasn't just the tattoo. It was the way she moved, the calm confidence she exuded, and the way she handled the rifle with such precision. Riley Shaw was someone he had heard about in the classified briefings, someone whose name had been spoken in hushed tones among the SEALs. She was the one who had been part of missions that defied all expectations. And she was the one who had vanished from the public eye, the one whose name was now only a ghost in the military's deepest files. Blake slowly stepped closer, his boots crunching against the gravel. He didn't know what to say, didn't know if she even wanted to be recognized, but he had to speak. The curiosity inside him, the need to understand who she truly was, finally broke through the professional barrier that had kept him distant. As he approached, he could feel the weight of the moment. There was no going back now. This wasn't just another encounter with an ex-soldier. This was a meeting with someone who had survived the impossible and paid the price for it. Riley Shaw, Blake said softly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen far too much. You were part of SEAL Team 9, weren't you? His words were careful, measured, but the question hung in the air. There was no mistaking it. He was not asking if she was part of the team. He knew the answer. He was asking her to confirm the identity of a living legend. Riley didn't flinch. Her eyes met his, calm and unyielding. She knew what was coming, had known for years that the truth would eventually be uncovered. But she had learned to live in the shadows, and the shadows were where she belonged. She said nothing for a long moment, allowing the weight of his words to settle between them. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice low and steady, almost distant. Blake took a step back, his mind racing as he processed the enormity of the situation. He had served with SEAL Team 9 for a time, but even he had only heard the rumors, the ones about the female operator who had completed missions so high risk they were classified as off-limits. He had heard the stories about the operation in the Zagros Mountains, the one where she had rescued 12 hostages from a compound that intelligence had deemed impenetrable. It had been a mission that no one thought would succeed, and it had succeeded thanks to Riley Shaw. But it had also come with consequences. The ghost of Coronado, Blake muttered under his breath. I thought it was all just rumors. They said you disappeared after the Zagros operation, that no one knew what happened to you. Riley's expression didn't change. Her past was littered with missions that were never supposed to happen, missions that had never been officially recognized. She had been forced into the shadows after she had done exactly what her country had asked of her, and in doing so, had made herself an inconvenient hero. I disappeared because they wanted me to, she said quietly. When you're the one who makes things go right, sometimes it's easier for others if you're out of sight. Blake's brow furrowed. He had always known that there were things in the military that went unspoken, things that never made it into the history books, but hearing it from her, hearing it directly from someone who had lived it, made the reality of those hidden truths sink in deeper. You were discarded, Blake said, his voice tinged with a mix of disbelief and admiration, because your success became a liability. Riley nodded slightly, acknowledging the harsh truth. It's easier for some to blame the soldier when something goes wrong. Sure, she said. It's easier than admitting the mission was flawed from the start. Blake stood there, taking in her words, the weight of her experiences pressing down on him. He had seen and heard many things in his career, but this was different. Riley Shaw was a woman who had sacrificed everything: her career, her future, and her peace of mind because she had done her job too well. She had become a liability not because she had failed, but because she had succeeded where others would have fallen short. How did you survive it? Blake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He was curious now, but it was more than that. It was a deep respect, an understanding of what it took to endure such a fate. Riley exhaled slowly, as if the question itself brought back memories she had tried to bury. I survived because I had to, she said, her voice cold but resolute. Because I wasn't the one who failed. The people I worked with, the ones who didn't make it out, they're the ones who stayed behind in places no one will ever know about. I survived because I kept moving forward, even when it was the hardest thing to do. Blake didn't respond immediately. He didn't have to. He could see the pain in her eyes, the weight of 1,000 memories that had shaped her into the woman she was. Now, he could see that, despite all the pain and loss, Riley had never truly stopped being the woman who had completed impossible missions. She had just been forced to bury that part of herself. I always heard that the ghost of Coronado wasn't someone you could forget. "Oh," Blake said after a long pause. "They said you'd done things that no one else could and that you paid the price for it. But no one ever told me the truth. No one ever told me you were standing right here, in front of me, still living with the consequences of what you did for your country." Riley didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her past, her sacrifices, and the reason she had disappeared were all now clear. Blake had unlocked the door to the truth, and now, for the first time in years, Riley didn't feel the need to hide from it. There was a long moment of silence as the weight of everything they had just shared settled between them. Blake knew that he would never look at Riley the same way again. She wasn't just another soldier who had served her time and gone home. She was a woman who had been through hell and back, and had done so without anyone ever truly understanding the cost of her service. You're not just an instructor here, are you?" Blake finally said, his voice filled with a new respect. "You're a living legend." Riley gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I'm just a woman who did her job," she replied quietly, the humility in her voice a stark contrast to the weight of her words. The atmosphere in the training area was different now, and the Marines who had once laughed and mocked Riley stood in a silent circle. Around her, their expressions a mix of disbelief and growing respect. Blake Harrison had introduced her as an advanced tactics instructor, and though his voice had been calm and authoritative, the weight of the title hit the Marines hard. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected the quiet woman they had underestimated to be the one, teaching them life-saving techniques that could very well mean the difference between life and death on the battlefield. Riley's movements were fluid, methodical, and deliberate. She didn't waste time on unnecessary explanations. Instead, she got right to the point, demonstrating combat techniques that only someone who had lived through the chaos of real battle could fully understand. She moved like a whisper, precise and purposeful, demonstrating how to clear a building, how to stay calm in a hostage situation, how to maintain situational awareness under fire. Each lesson was backed up with experience, with the kind of wisdom that couldn't be found in textbooks or manuals. The younger Marines, who had once scoffed at her, now watched closely, their eyes glued to every movement. They were no longer looking at her as just a civilian, a stranger with no place in their world. They were seeing her for what she was, a seasoned operator who had seen and done things they could only imagine. The disbelief in their eyes was slowly being replaced with a deep respect, an understanding that Riley had earned her place among them, even if she didn't need their recognition. As Riley demonstrated how to execute a tactical reload under stress, the room was quiet. The way she moved, the calm in her voice, the knowledge behind her actions. It was clear that she wasn't just teaching them tactics. She was imparting wisdom earned through blood, sweat, and tears. She wasn't just giving them lessons on how to handle a weapon or how to breach a door. She was teaching them the essence of survival, the kind of survival that went beyond basic training and reached into the core of what it meant to be a soldier. One of the younger Marines, a tall, muscular recruit who had been the most vocal in mocking her before, spoke up hesitantly. "Ma'am, how do you stay so calm? How do you not panic when everything's falling?" A part his voice was uncertain, and there was no bravado in it now. Only a genuine question born from a need to understand. Riley looked at him for a moment, her face stoic, her eyes never leaving his as she answered, "Fear keeps you alive. Panic gets you killed. The difference is training. You train until it becomes instinct, until your body responds without you thinking." Her words were simple, but they were profound. She wasn't telling him to be fearless. She was telling him how to survive fear. And the Marines, who had once seen her as just another civilian, now saw the depth of her knowledge. The respect in their eyes was palpable, and in that moment, they began to realize that Riley had been right all along. They hadn't known what it was like to be tested beyond their limits, but she had. As the session continued, the Marines started to ask questions, to engage with Riley in a way they hadn't before. The earlier mockery faded into the background, replaced by thoughtful questions and a keen interest in the lessons she had to share. Even the most seasoned Marines, who had been through their own grueling training, were taking notes. Riley was teaching them things that they had never been taught before, things they couldn't have learned in any classroom or simulation. She was teaching them what it really meant to fight, to survive, and to protect the people who depended on them. Blake stood off to the side, watching the transformation unfold before his eyes. He had known Riley's background, had seen the quiet authority she held, but watching the young Marines absorb her lessons was something different. It was the moment when they stopped seeing her as a woman who didn't belong, and started seeing her as someone they could learn from, someone who could teach them more than they had ever known. He felt a deep sense of pride in her, but there was also a part of him that mourned the loss of her time in the field, the years she had spent in the shadows, teaching only those who truly needed her. After the session ended, Blake gathered the Marines together, his voice carrying across the range. "You've just been trained by someone who's been through more than most of us ever will. Remember this moment. You don't get to see something like this every day. She didn't just teach you tactics, she taught you the mindset that could save your life one day." His words were simple, but they carried weight, and the Marines listened intently, absorbing the truth in them. As the group began to disperse, the same Marine who had asked Riley about staying calm approached her again, this time with a new look in his eyes. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say thank you. I didn't understand before, but now I do." He extended his hand to her, and for the first time, Riley met his gaze and gave him a small nod. It was all the acknowledgement she needed. By the end of the day, the Marines who had once mocked Riley now regarded her with deep admiration. They had witnessed her expertise firsthand, and the change in their attitudes was unmistakable. The woman who had been dismissed as an outsider was now one of their own, not because she had fought to prove herself, but because she had earned their respect through the quiet strength of her actions. And in that respect, the transformation was complete. Riley didn't need their praise. She didn't need their approval, but she had earned their recognition, and that was enough. As she packed up her gear, she felt a quiet satisfaction not from being seen, but from knowing that she had made a difference. The once skeptical Marines would now carry her lessons with them, and in the chaos of battle, those lessons would keep them alive. The Pentagon's offer came as a surprise. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to pull Riley into the spotlight, but this time it felt different. The letter she received was filled with praise for her exceptional service, with an offer that sounded like a dream come true for any soldier. Enhanced clearance, the chance to shape training across all military branches, a position where her experience would influence countless soldiers and officers. It was everything she had sacrificed for, everything she had worked toward. But as she read the letter, she felt nothing but a quiet sense of peace wash over her. Blake had been there when the letter arrived. He had watched her read it and then, without a word, fold it neatly and set it aside. He had asked, "So, what do you think?" But Riley's response came with no excitement, no joy at the recognition she had finally received. "I'm not interested," she had said simply. "It's not my path." Blake had raised an eyebrow, a mix of confusion and admiration on his face. "But Riley, this is a huge opportunity. It could change the way they train soldiers across the board." She had looked at him for a moment, her gaze steady and unflinching. "It's not about that for me," she had replied, her voice calm and certain. "It's not about changing systems or getting recognition. It's about teaching the few who need it, who deserve it, and who understand what it means to survive." The words had hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of her decision. Blake, despite his years of service, had never quite understood this part of her. To him, the opportunity to influence military training across the entire armed forces was a dream come true. But for Riley, it wasn't about grandeur or legacy. It was about quiet, real impact. The kind that happened when soldiers learned something that could save their lives. In the weeks that followed, Riley continued to teach her small group of Marines. The same faces who had once mocked her now sought her out for advice, training, and guidance. She had become a mentor, someone who shared the wisdom of years spent in dangerous operations. The lessons she taught weren't just about tactics or weaponry. They were about survival, about mental toughness, about the kind of decisions that only come from having been in the heat of battle. Riley didn't need a title or a position to make a difference. Every day she spent with her Marines, teaching them how to handle the chaos and unpredictability of combat, was where she found her purpose. Her refusal of the Pentagon's offer wasn't an act of rebellion or stubbornness. It was a decision born from deep self-awareness. She knew her value didn't lie in the accolades or the fancy titles that came with being part of a high-profile program. Her true service came from the quiet, unassuming way she shaped the lives of the soldiers who worked with her. She was teaching the next generation, not because she wanted to be a hero, but because she understood that the greatest heroes were the ones who never sought the spotlight. Riley's contentment came from the simple act of sharing her knowledge. She didn't need recognition. She didn't need the spotlight. What mattered was that she had lived through things that few people ever would. And the wisdom she had gained in those experiences was something she could pass on. That was the legacy she cared about, the lives she could help save, the soldiers she could prepare, the mistakes she could help them avoid. One evening, as she sat with a group of Marines after a particularly intense training, session, one of the younger recruits spoke up. "Ma'am, you ever think about going back to the field? After everything you've done. Shouldn't you be out there making a difference on the front lines?" The question was innocent, but it carried the assumption that Riley's place was out there. In the chaos of combat, leading missions, saving lives, Riley didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked out at the training field, where the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the land. It was a peaceful moment, a quiet end to a long day. She felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "I've made my difference," she said simply. "And now I'm teaching you how to make yours." The words were small, unassuming, but there was a quiet power in them. She had already done her part. Now, it was about ensuring the next generation of soldiers were ready for the challenges they would face. Her decision to stay away from the limelight was not a rejection of the military systems or a refusal to accept what had been offered to her. It was a recognition of what truly mattered to her. Riley didn't need to be a legend. She didn't need the Pentagon's approval or the fame that came with it. What mattered most was the quiet, meaningful work she did every day with those who needed her most. She had always understood something that few others did the most significant. Legacies weren't the ones shouted from the rooftops. They were the ones built over time, in quiet, personal moments. They were the ones left behind in the hearts and minds of those who learned from you, who carried your lessons with them long after you were gone. For Riley, this was enough. She had no need for accolades or awards. She had already achieved what most soldiers only dreamed of, the chance to pass on the lessons of a lifetime. And that, she knew, was worth far more than any position, any title, or any public recognition. Riley Shaw's legacy wasn't in the places she had been or the missions she had completed. It was in the lives she had touched, and the soldiers who would carry her teachings forward. And that, in the end, was the only legacy that truly mattered. Months had passed since Riley Shaw had first stepped onto the range, and by now, her story had quietly spread throughout the base. Whispers traveled between the barracks, in the mess hall, and during training exercises. Some Marines, new to the base or unfamiliar with her past, still regarded her as just another instructor. But for those who had worked with her reputation was something different. They had begun to understand that Riley wasn't just any trainer she was, someone whose life was steeped in the kind of experience that couldn't be faked. There was an air of respect that followed her wherever she went, even if no one dared to openly ask about her past. She had become a figure of silent competence, a person whose presence was felt more than it was acknowledged. Riley didn't seek recognition, but the change in the atmosphere around her was impossible to ignore. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the Marines under her tutelage carried the lessons she had imparted to them. It wasn't just about how to reload a weapon or how to clear a building. It was about something deeper, something intangible: humility, focus, and survival. She didn't lecture on these qualities. She simply embodied them. Every action, every lesson, every word was delivered with the quiet authority of someone who had been through it all and emerged stronger for it. The young Marines who had once mocked her now looked to her with quiet reverence, their eyes following her every movement, learning not just tactics, but the very essence of being a soldier. And Riley never changed. She didn't seek to change the Marines who worked with her. Her goal was simple: to teach, to pass on what she knew, and to make sure that the lessons of survival she had learned the hard way were carried forward. She had found her peace in this small, unspoken role, not in the recognition or accolades she could have received from the Pentagon or any other institution. The respect she commanded came not from her resume or her reputation, but from the quiet way she helped others rise to their full potential. In the end, it wasn't the number of lives saved or missions completed that mattered. It was the impact she had on the Marines she trained, the ones who would go on to do the same for others. One morning, as Riley walked through the range, she noticed something unusual. It wasn't the sound of boots or the chatter of the Marines practicing. It was something different. A small plaque had been placed near the firing line, just off to the side, tucked away from the typical flow of activity. The plaque was simple, unadorned, and unauthorized. It bore no name but a phrase that was unmistakable in its meaning: "Honor serves in silence." Riley stood for a moment, her gaze lingering on the plaque. She didn't need to read it again to understand its significance. It was a small tribute to her, a recognition not made by command, but by those who had learned from her, by those who understood what she represented. She didn't acknowledge the plaque, didn't let anyone know she had seen it. Instead, She turned and walked toward the Marines who were waiting for their next lesson, her expression as calm as always. But in the quiet space between the faintest exhale and the next moment, something shifted. It wasn't the plaque that mattered. It was the understanding behind it. Riley had never asked for recognition. She had never sought to make her name known, or to have her past etched in stone. But in this moment, she knew that her legacy was already secured. It wasn't about the words on the plaque or the moments of public acknowledgement. It was about the impact she had on the Marines she taught every day. As she worked with the Marines that morning, she noticed the subtle change in their behavior. They were different now, quieter, more focused, more precise in their movements. They no longer looked at her with the same uncertainty that had once marked their first encounters. Instead, they looked at her with understanding, with respect. Her teachings had sunk deeper than anyone had realized. The plaque, placed without ceremony, symbolized more than just her time at the range. It symbolized the quiet legacy of a woman who had given everything not for fame, not for glory, but simply for the hope that the next generation of soldiers would be better, prepared than the one before, and that, Riley knew, was enough. The lessons she had passed down were now woven into the fabric of those who had once mocked her. Her presence on the range had become synonymous with something more than just skill or knowledge. It was a presence that stood for something deeper, a quiet, unspoken understanding of what it meant to truly serve. As she moved on with her day, continuing her work without fanfare, she understood the significance of the plaque in a way that no words could ever fully capture. It was the perfect tribute to someone who had never needed a tribute in the first place. Her legacy, built through silence, had found its place among those who would carry it forward. Riley Shaw's influence quietly rippled beyond the boundaries of Fort Brixton, stretching out across the military community like an unseen but ever-present force. Stories about her began to circulate, shared among soldiers and officers, in hushed tones or with the reverence reserved for those who had truly made a difference. Her name became synonymous with competence, humility, and survival. As the Marines she had trained continued to excel in their duties, their performance improved, not just in the field but in the way they approached every challenge, every mission. They carried with them the lessons Riley had taught them, the importance of calm under pressure, the value of humility, and the unshakable resolve that came from real-world experience. Her impact was undeniable, even though she remained out of the spotlight. Despite her withdrawal from public view, Riley's teachings found their way into the heart of military training. The methods she had used, practical, grounded in experience, began to blend seamlessly with theoretical military training, creating a new standard that emphasized both mental toughness and technical skill. The transformation she had instilled in the Marines she had worked with became a model for others. Her approach wasn't flashy, it was straightforward, rooted in the realities of combat, and focused on preparation for the unpredictable nature of war. Riley never sought to be an icon or a figurehead, but in the quietest corners of the military, her influence was profound. Years later, Riley received another offer, this time from a prestigious position within the Pentagon. The proposal was filled with promises of power, recognition, and influence, and opportunity to shape military policies on a much larger scale. But the thought of stepping back into the world of high-profile decisions, away from the hands-on teaching that had become her quiet calling, did not appeal to her. She turned the offer down without hesitation, knowing that her work was done in the most meaningful way possible. Her satisfaction didn't come from the grandeur of an official position. It came from the knowledge that the Marines who had learned from her would carry her lessons forward, far beyond what she could ever accomplish from a desk or podium. Riley's refusal was a reflection of her quiet strength, her understanding that true fulfillment didn't come from accolades or public recognition, but from the lives she had touched. She had no need for acknowledgement from those above her. The real reward was seeing the Marines she had mentored grow into leaders, capable of making decisions under pressure, and ready to face whatever challenges came their way. In their success, she found her own. Her legacy was not in the titles she had turned down or the attention she had never sought. It was in the soldiers who had learned to act with the same quiet competence she had always embodied. She continued her work at the range, not for recognition, but because she believed in the Marines she was training. Each day was another opportunity to teach, another chance to pass on the knowledge that had kept her alive and had allowed her to save the lives of others. Riley found peace in these small moments, in knowing that the lessons she had learned through years of service, through pain, sacrifice, and survival were being passed down to those who would carry the weight of the world on their shoulders. She knew that the work she was doing, in its quiet and unassuming way, was making a difference. Riley's presence became a cornerstone in the lives of the soldiers who worked with her, even if the world outside never truly understood the full extent of her influence. The respect she had earned was not spoken in grand speeches or formal ceremonies. It was felt in the way her Marines carried themselves, in their approach to challenges, in their ability to remain calm and effective under fire. They had learned from the best, even if they never knew the full story of her past. One day, long after the plaque had been quietly placed near the firing range, Riley walked through the base, feeling the familiar weight of her rifle in her hands. She didn't look for recognition, didn't need to be reminded of her past. As she walked, she could hear the faint whispers, the stories that had circulated among the Marines, the stories that had become part of the lore of Fort Brixton. She didn't know who had placed the memorial plaque in her honor, nor did she care. But she knew one thing: her legacy was already secured, not in the form of titles or monuments, but in the lives she had touched, the Marines she had helped shape. As the years passed, Riley found herself more and more at peace with her decision to stay out of the spotlight, the world she had left behind, the world of missions, covert operations, and the pressure of constant recognition felt like another lifetime. She had come to understand that the greatest service she could provide was not in being seen, but in teaching others the skills that would make them better, more resilient, and more capable. The Marines she had trained would carry her lessons forward, and in that way, her influence would live on. It was the quiet legacy of a woman who had never needed to be remembered, because her work would speak for itself for generations to come. And so, Riley Shaw's legacy lived on, not in the accolades she had turned down, but in the soldiers who had learned to carry her lessons with them. Her story would never be written in the history books, but it would remain in the hearts of those who had been shaped by her. In that quiet, unspoken way, Riley had accomplished everything she needed to. Her impact had been made, and it would never fade.